Bonsoir and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to, together with all the team of the Institut Français du Royaume-Uni, to welcome you for this new edition of the Night of Ideas. And I will now call on the stage our ambassador, Madame Hélène Duchesne, who will formally open this edition of the Night of Ideas. Madame l'ambassadrice.
So, for the time being, I did nothing. Thank you very much, Bertrand. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, welcome to the Night of Ideas, a night of debates and entertainment, a night on friendship, uniting French and British minds. More. That is the question which will drive the debates and engage you in tackling contemporary issues, from the climate crisis to the post-MeToo politics, from the ethics of fashion to the new geopolitics, everything. In these changing and challenging times, when many of us feel the need to share ideas and exchange views, the Night of Ideas provides a platform to reflect upon current issues, rethink tomorrow, and see the world with new initiative. UK-wide, the Institut Français d'Écosse and the Maison Française d'Oxford are also taking part in the Night of Ideas, offering a program of screening and debates. Ahead of the Franco-British Summit that will be held in March, the 10th of March, and in the context of the current world events, it is everyone's interest to participate in these forward-looking discussions. Tonight, the program was created in close partnership with European Institute of the Faculty of Arts and Humanity at University College London and Global Engagement Department at King's College. It is enriched by the wonderful diversity of our guests, ideas about to build a responsible future and a society in which future generations can live in healthy and sustainable ways by the artists, athletes, academics, entrepreneurs, or fashion designers. We try to have so many people there. You will see. But before I close my short introduction, I would like to express my warmest thanks to the sponsors, without whom this event could not have taken place, the Friends of the French Institute Trust, the CIC Banque Transatlantique, and the French Institute in Paris. They all renewed their commitment. Last but not least, I shall add that this event would not have been possible without the Institut Français du Royaume-Uni and the French Embassy Cultural Section on either Education and Research Department. All my thanks to all of them, as my team and all the team who are preparing that for long, for very extreme and successful Nuit des Idées. Donc, je déclare ouverte la Nuit des Idées. I declare the Night of Ideas open. Et je vous souhaite une merveilleuse soirée et nuit de réflexion et découverte. Merci à tous.
Merci beaucoup, Madame l'ambassadrice. And now, please welcome on the stage Zadie Smith and Ted Hutchinson. And as they move on to the stage, please, Zadie, please, Ted, thank you very much. Please join me in, and thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. I will leave you the floor immediately. Zadie doesn't need much introduction, but we feel very privileged and very honored to host you here tonight for this new edition of the Night of Ideas. I'm not going to mention all the books that you have written, and we had a conversation before. But I'll just say that we are looking very much forward to your new book coming in September, The Fraud, and I understand that it will be also translated in French by Gallimard very soon, and we very much look forward to your new book. We also in France very much look forward to one of your last book, I mean your latest book actually, Feel Free, which will be published in French translation next June. Zedi will be in a conversation with Ted Hodgkinson, and thank you very much, dear Ted, for accepting our invitation. Ted is the head of literature and spoken word at the South Banking Center. He's a trustee of English Pen and chaired the International Booker Prize in 2020. I was about to forget, but I should mention that Zadie Smith has just been awarded a few minutes ago by Hélène Duchesne, by the French ambassador, the insignia of Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres in recognition and as a testimony of France's appreciation for all her achievements in the field of literature. The conversation will last about 30 minutes. It will be followed by the first roundtable of the Night of Ideas, entitled Can Democracies Solve the Climate Crisis? And just a small point of order, sorry for that. If you haven't booked your ticket for the next slot, we would kindly ask you at the end of the conversation to leave the space so that people who have booked space for the seat for the next roundtable can also enjoy it. Thank you very much. And now the floor is to you, dear Daddy, dear Ted. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bertrand and Ambassador, for those wonderful introductions. Zadie, it's wonderful to be opening the Night of Ideas with you. I'm very pleased that we could coordinate very French colours with our velvet this evening. As our time is relatively brief, I want to start by asking you about something that, looking back through your work, you've returned to again and again. From finely observed family dynamics in your fiction to an essay like Generation Y, you've long captured points of tension that exist between generations. And in your recent essay on the film Tar, you write that the gap between those in their 20s and those in their 50s, millennials and boomers, in your words, feels like it has never been wider. As a Gen Xer yourself, and I'm a geriatric millennial, I looked it up.
Yeah.
What do you think has brought about this widening gap between generations, and is there any hope of reconciliation?
First of all, I want to say I'm glad we don't have to work out how democracy is going to save the climate. That sounds like a pretty intense round table.
Me too.
Yeah, my question is much easier. I actually don't think, it was a kind of rhetorical play. When you think about it for a second, the gap is always the same, really. You can imagine in those polite 50s Americans looking at their 60s, 70s wild children and losing their minds in exactly the same way. It happens cyclically. It's always the same. But perhaps in extreme leaps of technology, it can feel more intense. But I don't think it necessarily is more intense. And I don't really conceive of it as warfare. I find it more comic than anything else, in its cyclical nature and how shocked we are to find the same things happening over and over. Yeah.
You write in the same essay that particularly online, the space between an individual and the positions that they hold has been collapsed, though, in this present moment. The phrase, as you write, ad hominem, has been rendered obsolete. Online, a person is the position they're maintaining, and vice versa. And what do you think the consequences of this are for the individual and for this cultural life?
For me, it's not really about making these kind of ethical judgments about the technology. All I'm interested in is making sure the technology isn't naturalized, so that you are aware of what it does to your structures of thought. Whether these things are good or bad is out of my purview. That's not my remit. Yeah. Every generation has to decide for themselves whether the technology they're using is using them or they're using it effectively. So that part, the kind of ethical part, doesn't concern me as much. What interests me is that whenever technology becomes invisible, when it seems to be natural, then what you've got in front of you is ideology. So I've got bracing, so that's why I'm lisping a lot, like a 12-year-old, so excuse me. But when that happens, when you don't notice that medium you're using is also structuring your thought, that's when you have a problem. So when I'm writing, all I'm trying to do, and it's partly from being on the outside, you're sometimes able to see things you can't see when you're on the inside. Yesterday I was on a train, I got on with my son and we looked down the carriage and it was overground, about 15 carriages of that, without exception. And I said to my son, you know, if you came transported from 1982, what would you think had happened? Like, what would you think was going on here? And he said, well, maybe they would be a transportative device, like they're about to, you know, take themselves somewhere else. I said, but would you imagine that they were just scrolling through pictures? He'd be like, no, he's only 9. He looked at it and thought, you wouldn't think that was what 15 carriages of people were intently doing at 9 in the morning. So it's more about, to me, the idea of the structure of thought, and there is certainly that case of an opinion and a technology colliding, but even more interesting to me is the dream of seeing something totally. And that's one of the things, I'm completely subject to this too. When you're online, you have the sense that you can, at some point, seize every point of view, every possible perspective and every subjectivity. You can kind of know it all, because Google knows it all. And so then when you're in the world and you find that human beings are limited within their subjectivity, often unable to see everything, we're almost shocked. It's like an offense. How did you not know my entire experience, my world? People talk about it as bubbles, but to me it's more the difference between knowing that life is limited and narrow for everybody and believing there is a consciousness that can contain it all at all times. And the only thing that can do that is the technology itself. Trying to be that yourself, to me, would be dementing. I'm always aware that my perspective is mine, narrow, subjective, conditioned by my life, my history, my body, all of those things are obvious to me, but I don't think of them as sins. I think of them as a condition of being human.
Yeah.
And of course you can try and stretch and understand what lies on the other side of your, you know, consciousness. You hope for that. That's one of the purposes of culture. But I don't think I hope for a singularity in my mind. I don't need to know everything all the time, all at once. So I love that movie, which is a kind of expression of that desire. I don't need that in my mind, and I don't think human minds are capable of it. I think it's painful trying to perform that action in your own brain.
I want to ask you about this sense of the self, because reading back through your essays, From Changing My Mind to Intimations, they, as you just put it there, they articulate a view of the self, which, to use some other words you've used about the self over the years, is ambivalent, malleable, improvised. And it's an ambivalent that I think is an animating tension in much of your fiction as well. It's something that you've dramatized there. And perhaps it's a view of humanity that Keats gave the name negative capability. It's that sense of that there's these uncertain, ambiguous parts of ourselves, and actually that those are integral to who we are. But do you feel that this view of the self is somewhat at odds with the contemporary culture, as you were just describing, especially online, that increasingly seems to value that singularity, as you put it, a fixed identity, and perhaps ideological purity?
All you can do as you get older is remember the things that perhaps worked when you were young, which may be of use. They might not be of use. It is up to every generation to reject entirely what came before if it's not a utility, if it's not useful for them. But I do think it's not just, Keats himself is like an asceticized self, which is wonderful for writing poetry, but not very useful at the barricades. But that kind of self mixed with a sense of identity which is fluid between groups. Sorry about this lisp. That's how I grew up. So my parents were what I guess you would now call, you know, local activists. They were out in the streets. But when they were out in the streets, they were out under very broad umbrellas, because they had to be. So sometimes those umbrellas were black and Asian, sometimes they were socialists and communists, sometimes it was South Africans, the South African Jews, and Hindus from our neighborhood. We went in umbrellas. And that is how my political consciousness was formed, with the idea that the person next to you in the rally might not be your ideological twin. You might be a gap between you, but for the purposes of this action, we're going to walk to Trafalgar Square together. And that's how I grew up. So that might not be a useful lesson for a new generation, but it's the one I know. that it is possible to join with others in united political action across all kinds of minor differences, even major differences. And something my father used to say, which I've ended up putting in this book, not to make the perfect the enemy of the good, which is an important moral principle to me. And even writing this last novel, thinking about slavery a lot and about the incredible 400-year movement to try and end it. As long as there was slavery, there was also a movement that tried to end it, both in rebel slaves and activists and women's groups and all kinds of groups that might seem to us inane, politically useless in some ways, naive, romantic. But I don't need people to be perfect to change things. I just need a lot of people with a lot of different ideas, some of them debased, some of them foolish, some of them half-assed. But it worked in the end. It took far too long. But those kind of models of collective action are worth considering because they worked. It doesn't mean that heaven immediately replaces the terrible system that precedes it, but something does, and then something else. But those kind of wishy-washy liberal ideas about, arcs of justice and all the rest of it, that to me is not a useful concept. What's useful to me is, can I let go of my desire for perfection, both ideologically and personally, and take a hand here and see what happens?
Do you think we're at a moment more broadly where that might be happening, where that quest for perfection, perhaps that singularity, we're at risk of losing the sense of, basically, as your father put it, that we're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good?
I mean, I don't know. I don't have a political imagination. I have a novelist imagination. I'm a novelist. And I'm also aware of being maybe peculiar. Like when I hear people speak about the desire to belong and to be amongst their people, and I never had that as a child because my household was not one thing. I've never lived in a world in which everybody's one thing and it's important to be together in one place. Everything about my life was crazy. Two people who should never have met are married to each other. We live in a neighborhood where every single house has a different faith, a different person, a different language. That is a solidarity, I know, and I don't... sometimes I think we shouldn't, you should probably not take political lessons from novelists because we tend to be peculiar as a breed. But I certainly don't have those atavistic need to belong. I don't need anyone to call me a collective name. I don't need to be in a group. I don't really even like to be in a group. So I am aware of that in me, and I know that's not true for a lot of people. A lot of people really get a lot out of that feeling of sameness, whereas I just never have. To me, what motivates me is interest. I have sentimental feelings for my neighborhood, for my people, for my culture, but they're not limited to that. They spread. I can't help that.
Relatedly, I mean, you've often, as you just expressed there, been somewhat sceptical about claims of the social utility of art, but at the same time, as you just articulated in the new novel and in many of your novels, you've addressed some of the issues that are going to be debated this evening. And do you think that the space for making art and for writing novels, which perhaps doesn't necessarily always have to demonstrate its social utility, is shrinking?
I think about it a different way. Like I don't, if I think of my work being of use to people who actually do things, real political people, real activists, real politicians, real people in the street, the only use I can see, in my view, is that in all those ideological modes, you have an idea of the subject, the human subject. And what I noticed even in childhood, sitting around with like my mother's Marxist friends, is that quite often the human subject is annoying to these people. It's like the proletariat isn't political enough, or the middle classes won't. There's always something wrong with the subject you're trying to transform. And it's usually because the idea you have of that subject is quite flat, right? Yeah. So the working man in the mind of an unimaginative Marxist is just about to throw down his tools and run out to join the revolution. Well, if you grew up with working people, you know that's not the fucking case. You can encourage him, but it's not an immediate thing because you present it to him in your lovely middle-class language. Why don't you join the revolution? In my dad's case, he'd be like, I'm making dinner, not today. So these kind of things, these human realities are sometimes missing from our ideological projections. It doesn't mean that we can't make these ideological dreams politically active, but it would be useful perhaps if you want to save people and help people to know what people are, to actually know what they do, how they act, how they feel, what they say, how disappointing they are sometimes, how full of sin or mistake or error. Or if your vision of the subject you're trying to save as an activist or as a politician is flat, if all you can say about them is black woman, white guy, boomer, these terms, you're not going to get anywhere because you don't know humans. So to me, the only real utility of art is to remind those people, these are what humans are. If you want to work with them, if you want to do something for them, you might need to know how they actually are.
And is that in particular one of the things that the novel can do, right? That it rounds out that flattened subject and makes it suddenly impossible to put them in a binary or in a category of one of those.
You hope so, but it's in no way a done deal, you know? The Nazis read Tolstoy. It's not something, it's not a one-to-one relation. You can't hope that someone picks up Madame Bovary and suddenly is filled with empathy for humanity. I don't think it works that way. But at the same time, as naive as those kind of high humanist dreams for the novel were, I know, and I presume most of you in this room, if your readers know, that it's not nothing, that it does make some kind of difference, and that those of us who do read are in some way formed out of the books we've read, and it's no guarantee of right behavior or political right behavior, but it's not nothing. And so people write and read.
Your books they follow and track so closely often to the neighbourhood you grew up in and the area of London that you know so well. And I'm intrigued that your new novel does the same, but it tracks back in time. And I wondered if you could talk about what drew you to do that. What was the compulsion to move backwards in history for this one?
It's so ridiculous. Like, when I think about it now, I don't know, to me it feels like fate, like you don't, with certain books you don't choose exactly, it just happens. And in this case, this story, which is absolutely from my neighbourhood, but in the 1830s, it's true, everything in it is true, and I was just incredibly lucky to find it, and it just happened to be all the things that interest me in one story. Jamaica, England, slavery, colonialism, imperial, it was everything in one story, and it was true, and it just seemed like it was there for me. So I just got lucky, I think, and maybe you get lucky once in your life. So I'm just glad it happened. But it is ridiculous that I've written another book about NW6. But I can promise you the story, it's not my story, so I can say it without humility. The story is incredible, and I just was so lucky to come across it.
Is that a completely different experience, novel experience for you to inhabit a completely an existing story that's outside of your work?
Yes, it was joyful, with no self-consciousness, with no doubt or fear or anything really, because the heavy lifting was done by reality. All I had to do was get it across.
I'm sure we did a little more than that, but I want to ask relatedly about your debut play, which is an adaptation of Chaucer's Wife of Bath, set in Willesden, and again in exactly the same.
Yeah, it's in Willesden again.
Yeah,
thanks, Ted.
It's the universe in a grain of sand. But I'm wondering what drew you to Chaucer's tale, particularly it being this unabashed tale of female desire at this moment, and also to writing a play, because until now you've been writing fiction.
You know what? The whole thing happened by accident, and it's a silly story that I won't retell. But it's that I wrote about it a little bit in the book version. But for me, once I got started doing it, I just, as I've got older, I've just been more and more interested. It was when I was young, it was an anxiety. Like, I'm from working people, and now I'm writing in what is basically a middle class form. How can I ever square that circle? It always stressed me out. And the thing that I really wanted to do, because when I was a kid, I remember it, is write in a way which in no way dumbs down anything, but is open enough that anyone can pick it up. It's important to me. It's like an aesthetic principle, it's a political principle. It matters. Because I remember opening books and not knowing what the French phrase was, or it was like a block every time. Like you knew you didn't have the right school or the right education to read this particular book. And then as you get older and you read the very greatest thinkers, you realize, when you're Wittgenstein, you speak in plain language. It's only idiots who create this mess. You can be very plain and say exactly what you want to say. So with Chaucer, I think that's what I love about Chaucer, that the ideas in The Wife of Bath are very highfalutin, really. They're kind of religious, philosophical, political, but he was committed to the language of the people, of writing in this demonic English. And of course we've got Shakespeare as another example, but I like that model. Obviously, I guess to some people it must look very strange. What is this black girl doing translating Chaucer? But we have a class relation in England, that matters. It matters to me anyway. So when I did it, I wanted to write in the vernacular of Kilburn High Road, particularly black Kilburn, particularly, to be more specific, Jamaican, British Kilburn. And once I did that, it became so much fun, And lots of other voices are in there, Poles, there's a Polish guy, and Cockneys, and just that kind of variety of voices on my high road is something I've loved all my life. And in Chaucer, it was just a perfect outlet for it all.
I mean, was it partly that sense that actually the people that you find in Chaucer are still around us today?
Yeah, it was so easy to translate, shamefully easy, because there wasn't that much difference, in terms of the way things are presented, the jokes. English people always find scatological stuff funny. They always find sex comedy hilarious. Like, we're not that complicated as a people.
Haven't moved on much.
No, we haven't moved on much in 600 years. So that part was kind of easy. And then the most challenging ideas in it about consent and sovereignty over your body, I guess I just got lucky again. It really was in the air anyway as a conversation. And so it was fun to think of it through Chaucer back through Alvita, this Jamaican woman in her 50s. And, when you go and see the show, it's like nothing to do with me. The way they put it on is so spectacular, but it's like a dream of theatre, where you go in and you have that usual theatre feeling in England, like, oh, fuck, I got to see a play, oh, for God's sake. Dread comes over you. Yeah. And then instead, you have an amazing time. Yeah. And that's what I always wanted to happen in theatre, just to have that joy you imagine in the whatever the bottom seats are in the Globe, 500 years ago. That feeling of just delight, like, tell me a story. Yeah.
From scatological British humour, I want to ask you a little bit about French culture, particularly, I suppose, whether you might have any particular French literary touchstones that you have appreciated in your work.
I mean, I'm hugely intimidated, even to be here. I don't have French, I have Italian. For some reason, I learned Italian. I love Italian, but it would have been a little more useful to learn French, particularly for tonight. But for me, the biggest French influences are philosophical. So it just happens that the college I went to, at the time I was there, the professor there, well, a lot of the professors were obsessed with post-structuralism, French writers and deconstruction. So my whole philosophical education, in fact, really, when I should have been doing an English degree, we were surreptitiously doing a degree in French philosophy, thanks to these professors. So my mind is shaped that way. And Fanon, who was my mother's favourite, I read really young, like 11 or 12. And so Fanon for me is like the shape of my brain. And when I think about race and colonialism and all that, it's Fanon. I have never said anything on any of those topics which isn't what he had already said. So to me, that's the biggest influence, I think, because it was mind-forming. And the literature I've always loved, though, I have always been intimidated by it. I always wanted to write, you won't believe me, but every time I sit down, I think I'm going to write a 95-page French novella. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be about existence. And then it just never, it never happens. It never happens. I still dream. But I'm always, I went through a career phase and an Annie Ernaux phase. I get these obsessions. I read everything and think, why don't I live in Paris and have these thoughts? But it's admiration, But the English are condemned to this social novel. It's just in our history and in our culture, and it is a shame sometimes. I think it is a shame. Sometimes I think I wish I hadn't read so much Dickens as a child, or I wish I'd been raised in a different tradition, but I'm in a tradition I am in.
Do you not feel that some of them you might have smuggled into your fiction, perhaps surreptitiously? Or?
There's a lot of French thought in my fiction, I would say, and a lot of the thought which matters most to me, which is existentialism, which falls on very stony ground in England, historically. But that's what matters to me. And when I'm writing fiction, when I'm thinking about characters, that's what I'm thinking. That being precedes essence, that I don't believe in essential natures. I just don't believe in it. And I guess that when people find me suspicious politically, that's what they're sniffing out. I'm not an essentialist. I just don't believe it. I believe in power structures. I absolutely believe in exploitative power structures, but I don't believe in the essential nature of peoples. I don't. I'm not a believer in that. So that's always going to be a problem between me and people who really believe there is such a thing as, I don't know, a feminine soul or a black soul. Or I don't believe these things. I believe in culture, oppression, structural situations, but not in essential qualities of humans. No.
So that's Sartre, Camus, and
yeah.
And
So that's straight off the French boat. Yeah, into my brain.
I think we've got time for maybe just one more question. The theme for this evening, as was mentioned earlier, is more with a question mark, which has a particular resonance for me as a father of two, although they tend to use it with an exclamation mark rather than a question mark. I wonder what that word conjures for you as a novelist, as a human, whether it's, perhaps to me it seems that it's a fundamental way of expressing our wants and needs, and what perhaps it brings to mind.
I'm just always thinking about limits, like the re-establishing of a limit. I don't think humans are infinite people. I don't think the world is infinite. And the problem, I spent 20 years in America where even the word limit is offensive. They hate the idea that anything is limited. Even, I remember the thing I had so often there when I'd say something like, I'm middle-aged, like when I was 42. Every woman around me would be like, what are you talking about? I'm like, how long do you think I'm going to live? How long do you think you're going to live? It's like a continual delusion of like limitless. They even have the film, right? Limitless. The idea of just going on forever in all directions. So I'm just a citizen. I'm no expert, but it seems to me plainly obvious that limit is the key to the next 20, 30, 40 years. And I sometimes think it like convey it in my own mind as the banana problem. It sounds stupid, but we're so used to eating bananas every day of the year, and that is the problem in my mind. I know it sounds silly, but trying to imagine a society in which you say, no more bananas, no more. Why? Because we don't grow them here. Why can't you have them now? Because it's not the season. You're just not eating any more of those. And that's the smallest version of it. And even that, I can feel in the audience a feeling of like, really? And so what is required is so extraordinary. It's asking people to give up something they've come to believe is a natural right. Air travel, moving towards the sun wherever it is, fruit whenever you want it. These things, you're asking them to effectively go back in time. And I have absolutely, the next panel perhaps is going to figure that out for you. But I don't know how it happens, apart from on the other side of a cataclysm. That's usually when these things happen. But I'm not a political scientist, I don't know, but it's so hard to conceive of.
Well, Zadie, I wish we had longer to solve these
Thank
things.
you.
Thankfully, there's a whole evening of discussions where they will be unraveled.
Doing that exactly. Thank God for them.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
everybody for being here. And
Thank you.
A little bit of diversity. You're only here to break up the diversity. I hope you realize that.
So we're going to, I don't want to crash people's break too much, so we'll continue to 7:30 if that's okay. Is that all right for everyone? Yeah. So we'll keep everything kind of tight and I'll leave more time for questions. Yeah, they've said, yeah, so it's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, just keep it nice and tight. Good evening, everyone. There are seats here in the second row here, plenty of seats up at the back there, and some in the middle here. Welcome to our panel this evening. Yep, plenty more seats. There are more seats at the front here, and some on this side. And this is the panel debate on climate change. Just so you're all aware, we're going to talk about whether democracies can solve the climate crisis. So I'll just give you another minute to take your seats. I think, madam, you can have Zadie Smith's seat. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yeah, you can take that. Excellent.
This is the
That's right. Thank you very much for that. And thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you for joining this panel. This discussion, as I said, is going to be about the climate crisis. Can democracy solve the climate crisis? I am Fiona Harvey. I am the environment editor of The Guardian newspaper, and I've been writing about the climate crisis for more than 18 years now. And yes, it's still a crisis. It's more urgent than ever, of course, though. And just to give you an idea of how urgent it is, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned last year that it was now or never on the climate crisis. We need to halve global emissions in this decade if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. And that's a crucial limit, because beyond that we get all kinds of catastrophic consequences of the climate crisis. Meanwhile, greenhouse gas emissions are actually still rising, and we've seen this week that oil companies are making bigger profits than they ever have in history. I think there are oil companies that have been making several £million a minute for the past year. Astonishing sums. Things are going in exactly the wrong direction. So that's why we're asking tonight whether democracies can really solve the climate crisis. Democracy, of course, one of France's greatest exports, arguably, since 1789. But we're going to call that into question tonight and ask whether the short-term nature of democracies, driven by elections, whether those democratic methods are unfit for the climate emergency, and indeed some kind of other form of government, command and control perhaps, might be more appropriate to the crisis we face. Yes, it will be as if the Bastille never fell. That's the debate we're having tonight, and I've got three very distinguished panelists to discuss that for you. First of all, I've got Lisa Van Halle, who is a professor in political science at University College London. She's actually working on a book about climate change and loss and damage. Loss and damage refers to the catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis that we're already seeing in developing countries, things like devastating floods or droughts. So that's what we're talking about there. Lisa's going to enlighten us further in a moment. I also have Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who is co-president of the Club of Rome and a climate change activist. She lectures, facilitates, and advises on the climate crisis, and she's responsible for this, Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity. And I think there are copies in the foyer as well downstairs. You'll probably see them. So she'll be coming from that point of view. And then we also have Roman Krznaric, who is a philosopher. He's a senior research fellow at Oxford, and he's the author of the international bestseller, The Good Ancestor, which is subtitled How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. So, I'll be asking, first of all, can democracies solve the climate crisis? Lisa, I'll take you first.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Fiona. It's a real pleasure to be here. Merci. Let's start with what we know. What does the research tell us? So political science and economics research has shown that democracies have taken a stronger stand on reducing greenhouse gas emissions than non-democratic regimes. I want to articulate some of the reasons why democratic regimes might be well suited to addressing the climate crisis. I'll then turn to some reasons why they might be less well suited, and then I'm going to offer two additional perspectives. So we know that democracies tend to cooperate in international environmental treaties more, they adopt stricter environmental policies, and they're more effective in curbing their carbon dioxide emissions. Why might this be the case? The conventional wisdom suggests that there are several mechanisms within democratic systems that facilitate their ability to address climate change. First, press freedom and the freedom of expression allows media to increase public awareness of climate change and facilitates the flow of scientific information. Second, fair electoral competition provides opportunities for green parties and green interests to organize and participate in political processes. Third, freedom of association allows civil society organizations to operate and gives room for environmental NGOs to conduct information campaigns and advise decision makers and influence policy development. And fourth, respect for the rule of law means that international environmental agreements are more likely to be complied with by democracies. However, we also know that democracies are not doing enough, fast enough on climate change. This despite the fact that in the UN system, they had agreed almost 30 years ago to take the lead on addressing climate change. So we know there are also mechanisms within these systems that work against effective climate action. Democratic rulers are often short-sighted. They focus on short-term gains rather than committing to long-term projects, such as mitigation. Business interests, of course, can heavily influence political decisions in democracies and can sometimes steer political leaders away from adopting more ambitious climate commitments. We also know that there's substantial variation in how democratic regimes perform on addressing climate change, with relatively little understanding of what explains that variation. Let me offer two additional perspectives on this question of whether democracies can solve the climate crisis. First, probably most people in this room will be aware of the growing number of legal cases being brought to prompt governments and corporations to take action on climate change. And most recently, the NGO Client Earth lodged a case against the directors of Shell over their climate strategy, saying it's inadequate for meeting these climate targets. And this is part of a much broader and accelerating trend of turning to the courts, where citizens see their elected officials failing to act on climate change. Of course, the use of litigation as a tool of social and political change has a long history, and there are many lessons to be learned about what works and what doesn't. from the US civil rights movement, even going back to legal challenges over abolitionism. But what I want to highlight is that there may be some institutions within democratic regimes, courts and human rights institutions, for example, that may be better suited to countering the short-termist approach of elected office holders. Second, when we talk about addressing the climate crisis, we need to be really clear here about what we mean. Really tackling the problem of climate change is no longer just about focusing on mitigation. It also requires societies around the world to adapt to the now, present, and inevitable consequences of the climate crisis. Think of the floods in Pakistan last summer, the devastating effects of increasingly intense heat waves and hurricanes and wildfires. But we might also want to think about what Rob Nixon has called the slow violence, those slower changes, sea level rise, oceans that are acidifying, biodiversity that's being lost, glaciers that are melting. So when we talk about this idea of solving the climate crisis, that means also facing up to responsibilities to remedy the harms and losses that are being borne by those that have done the least to contribute to the problem. So we also need to look at the role of democracies in adapting to climate change and in addressing those losses and damages. This requires dealing with questions like what types of adaptation measures are most appropriate in a particular context. What kinds of procedures are going to be used to decide what kinds of climate risks are tolerable for communities? And finally, whose voices are included in those political processes and whose interests and what identities might be marginalized or invisibilized? So to really address this question, can democracy solve the climate crisis? I would argue we need to actually broaden out the question in a number of different ways. First, what do we mean by democracy here? What role do different democratic institutions play? How does democracy and different forms of democracy interact with different forms of capitalism? And finally, when we talk about solving the climate crisis, how do we grapple with the full range of measures that are needed, not only to prevent climate change, but to remedy the havoc that is already being caused in the world? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. That's a very useful introduction there, and lots to chew on for the other panelists, I think. Sandrine, tell us what you think.
So I want to build on this, and thank you, Lisa, for setting the stage, and maybe in this testimonial, a vow to the fact that actually just last year in a New York Times Oxford debate, which was on this exact question, myself and colleagues fought for the fact that we needed an authoritarian state to get us out of the climate mess. And when we started our arguments, we didn't think we would win, but we actually did. We won the debate. Now that is scary. And that's scary because clearly, and there were as many people as in this room who decided that actually the need for greater authority from the state is fundamental if we are truly going to get out of the climate mess. It's also scary because it does reveal, to the point that Lisa has made, the very key question around what is a democracy and have we lost sight of what that actually is. If we unpack the word, demos and kratos, demos is people, kratos is power. It seems to be kratos that has taken over our democracies. A power not for the people, but actually power for a few. And if you look at, in particular, at some of the greatest democracies, for example, in the United States, and you see the amount of time that is actually spent by members of Congress on serving the people versus actually inquiring, being part of lobbying discussions, 6 to 8 hours per day of their time is spent in discussing with lobbyists. So the key question here is, are our democracies broken? Does that mean that we then need to go into this bipolar analysis, which is, for the moment, democracy versus dictatorship? Absolutely not. And that is where I'd like to bring in a 21st century context. We are now faced with the polycrisis. Polycrisis and compound effects means that we actually will be having to act in continuous chaos mode. To plan for the long term, and we very much at the Club of Rome talk about systems change, we need to think through short-term levers that actually enable us to build the deep systems change that we need in our democracies to address inequality, to address poverty, and to address also the very deep need of ensuring that women and other cultures are fully included, not only in our economies, but actually in most of our political structures. That means a total rethink as we're in the midst of this climate, COVID, conflict, crisis mode. And so that is what we've tried to do in Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity. In fact, the way in which we have modeled the interrelationships between all these crises and looked at possible solutions has brought us to the very conclusion that it is social tipping points that will be our greatest existential risk. Those social tipping points, which we as people, and in particular our leadership, has created, because we are living in an age where actually inequality is going up and well-being is going down, where wealth is in the hands of a few, you've just mentioned multinationals, and yet the many are suffering from energy poverty, from inflationary impacts, from the lack of access to food, from conflict, and from deep, deep poverty, even in Western societies, where neoliberal economics were supposed to actually give us the possibility of greater wealth distribution. So I think what's very important, Fiona, with regard to your question around democracy, is the instability now with regard to our democracies will not only come from the climate challenge, but also from the growing inequality that the climate challenge will only further increase alongside other compound effects of pandemics and of conflicts. And that circularity and that continuous feedback loop will make it increasingly difficult for democracies to truly function. So how do we guarantee real demos, leadership for the people? That will be part of what hopefully Roman will tell us about. Making sure that we have more and continued citizen activism, accountability of our leadership, making sure that we actually do elect the leaders that have, like Jacinda Ardern and others, who truly have a vision of what a well-being economy looks like, and making sure that we fight inequality. And that is a structural result of a capitalistic system and short-term leadership that has forgotten that they were elected by people to service the people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a very important point, and actually reminds me rather of a previous UN climate chief who sat in a room full of world leaders, all talking about, the need to take action on the climate crisis, and he turned around and said to them, "I've never seen so many political leaders sit around talking about the need for political will. You're the ones who are supposed to have it." Yeah. So, what can we do about this, Roman?
Well, I think my children have the solution, in a way. At the time of the last UK general election, my partner and I decided to give our twins, who were then 11, an unusual birthday present. We decided to give them our votes. So we sat around the kitchen table and we debated the party manifestos, and they told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And they didn't exactly follow our political opinions, but that was all right. That was part of the purpose of it. Because why did we do this? We know that our political system systematically failed to take into account the interests and welfare and rights of the billions upon billions of people who will be born in the future, the children, the grandchildren, and so on. And we know why there's a problem here. The problem is that we live in the age of the tyranny of the now. The fact that our politicians can't see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet, businesses beyond the quarter report, we're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. And we all know we need more long-term thinking to deal with multiple problems in society, planning for the next pandemic on the horizon, risks from AI and bioweapons, but particularly for the ecological crisis, which is here now, yes, but because of the slow violence that Lisa mentioned, is going to get worse and worse and worse. So the way I think about this and our relationship with the future is that humankind, particularly in the wealthy countries of the global north, has colonized the future. We treat it like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And of course, there is somebody there. And the tragedy of the situation is that the billions of people who will inhabit the future aren't here to do anything about this pillaging of their inheritance. They can't go an assault march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They can't stay to sit in like a civil rights activist. They can't throw themselves in front of the king's horse like a suffragette. They have no rights, they have no representation. And this is a question, well, this is an issue which took me a long time to understand. I used to actually be a political scientist myself about 25 years ago. I used to teach courses on democracy. It never once occurred to me that we failed to give a voice to future generations in our political systems. And look, you can have all the SDGs in the world that you want, but if your political systems are still caught in short-term cycles, you're not going to get very far. So what can we do? Well, there is a little bit of good news here, which is that there is enormous energy around the redesign of democracy in many countries to start having a longer view. In Wales, for example, you've got a Future Generations Commissioner whose job is to look up to 30 years ahead. The commissioner doesn't have a lot of power, but it's a model that's starting to be worked with in other countries. One place where I think there's something interesting going on is in Japan, where there's a movement called Future Design. And it's a citizen-led grassroots movement. And what Future Design does, it's actually based, they're inspired by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision making, so making decisions looking 7 generations ahead. And what they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they divide them into 2 groups. Half are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these ceremonial robes to wear. I'm going to put mine on. This is from the town of Yahaba, northern Japan, population 30,000. So the other half of the group who've given the gowns are told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out that the residents in 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative and radical plans for their towns and cities, whether it's on climate, on dealing with automation, aging, all sorts of issues. And Future Design as a model is spreading to lots of different places, being used in big cities like Kyoto and Japan's Ministry of Finance, big companies as well. And of course, it's going to sound familiar to you because this is about citizens' assemblies, and we know that over the last, say, 15 years, there have been more than 200 citizens' assemblies in the OECD, about a quarter of them on climate, and they tend to have a longer-term view, lots of good studies on this, than your regular politicians who are caught up in all the corporate accountability issues and all those kinds of things. Now, there's very mixed results from citizens' assemblies, whether it's the one in France or the stuff in Ireland. I've been involved in some of those, but they tend to come out with some good stuff, and we're just learning to work with citizens' assemblies. I would like the House of Lords in Britain to be replaced by a citizens' assembly. I think that would be a good idea, partly to help deal with exactly the problems that we're talking about. I think there's a third and final area where I think democratic design can happen, which Lisa mentioned, which is around the law. I think it's extraordinary that probably the biggest revolution in human rights since the French Revolution is going on right now, which is young people taking governments to court, claiming rights for future generations. Our Children's Trust in the United States, leading a series of cases at the state and federal level on behalf of 21 young people who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Cases in the Netherlands, the Agenda case. In Germany, the Constitutional Court. A case recently failed in Australia at the federal level. Successful cases in Pakistan and Colombia. And of course, all the legal cases around ecocide starting to emerge and the rights of the living world. The Wanganui River in New Zealand, the Mar Menor in Spain. All of this is adding up to something that we absolutely need to recognize, which is that the democracies that we have were born in the Holocene. They were born in the 18th and 19th century when the world was different and had different problems. We need to redesign democracy for the Anthropocene so we can become the good ancestors that future generations deserve.
Great, thank you very much. That's an inspiring vision. But do we have time for that? Do we have time to redesign our democracies? Because, we've got to act so quickly on the climate crisis. And as you say, our democracies have been there for, more than a century. They're institutions that have grown up over long periods of time. How do we do that? Perhaps Sandrine.
Yeah, I think that do we have time? No. Having come out with the limits to growth, and I want to build also on what Zadie said, actually, whereas we need to start thinking about limits. And we didn't 50 years ago. We published the Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome. We don't have another 50 years. That was an empty world. Now we're in a full world. So do we have time to totally redesign and overhaul our democracies? Well, maybe we can at least come back to what original democracies were supposed to be about, which was servicing people. The second is to think through what are then some of those short-term levers. Part of it is to use the legal system. And very clearly that's what's happening through the ecocide laws, and many governments are now being held accountable. And that is also due to citizens and also other groups that are very much taking them to court, scientists, etc. I think the other key is that those of us who are working with politicians need to give them the tools to truly change without them actually getting caught with their pants down. I mean, a lot of the discussions that I have with some of the European policymakers is when you're in the midst now of deep energy poverty and you know that actually populism is going to be on the rise, going against democracy is going to completely shake up your own political career. It's going to shake up the way in which we interact with the economy. It's going to make our value chain issues right now seem tiny in comparison to what we're going to see in the future. So then how can we now already shift? How can we, for example, start to work with citizens on solidarity checks? Think through that inequality issue, which is so incredibly deep. Speak to the citizen about a different type of future, a different type of policy. Work through that together. And that timing issue, actually, it can be quite quick if we do it right. Transformation in crisis is possible. We saw it through COVID, for good or for bad. And we have to remind ourselves and tap into our subconsciousness of how so many people went back to what was most essential, including our governments. Finally, oh my God, they realized that social services and medical care was absolutely essential for the survival of its citizens. Why the hell didn't they do that before we got into the pandemic?
Yes, well, quite, but that didn't stop the pandemic from happening, did it? Lisa, I'd like to bring you in this as well. And if you could also address, Lisa, this litigious approach of kind of, you know, taking people and governments and companies to court, is that really effective? Because, you know, Shell got taken to court successfully, and it's now just posted enormous profits and it's rowing back on some of its green commitments. So, you know, really, is it effective?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I suppose it's what do you mean by effective whenever we think about, for example, strategic litigation, which is talked about a lot in this space. And so if you think about, you know, litigation can be slow. It can take years and years, right? There are cases coming up in the European Court of Human Rights this year, the kind of young people in Portugal, senior women in Switzerland, some big cases coming up. Those have been trickling through the courts for years coming up, right? And often in our democratic systems, we think of litigation as a last resort, right? You've tried other policy avenues. You've tried influence policymakers. You've worked through legislatures and things haven't worked there. And so you go to the courts after all those processes have been exhausted. So it's not, in some ways, litigation goes against the kind of crisis urgency narrative once it's trickled through the courts. But what we're seeing is a volume of cases, right? And cases are being lost, and yet they're being covered in the media, in The Guardian, and talked about. And so there are other avenues to change that are available when using this strategy that are faster and that are maybe more promising in some ways. And because there are also limits to what courts will do. And certainly the judiciary in this country can be fairly conservative in some ways. And so it's by no means a panacea, and it can't be used in isolation as a tool. And there can be unintended consequences. You need to think about whose voices are included in those processes, how those decisions are made.
Thank you. And Roman, I'd like to ask you, because you talked about governing for the future, governments governing for the future. Well, I can think of someone who could govern for the future, and he's the King, King Charles. You know, the royal family's it's got a vested interest in long-termism. It's got a very long history. It hopes to have a very long future. You know, and we've actually seen King Charles. He's probably the most outspoken public figure and member of the government, essentially, on this issue. So is that what we need? Do we need monarchies?
So this goes back to something that Sandrine was mentioning about basically the idea of benevolent dictators. Are they okay? You know, my dad thinks that, you know, we should deal with the climate crisis through benevolent dictatorship, and he's a sort of card-carrying socialist. I once went to a talk by Martin Rees, is he still the Astronomer Royal? He said exactly the same thing. And as you say, there's a sort of swathe of public opinion think, right, we need to be like China, we need to be like Singapore, give up some civil liberties, we can take action, maybe even Prince Charles could do it for us. But, so I got interested in this question a while ago, King Charles, whatever he is. Look, we're in a Republican space here, are we not? So I got interested in this question a while ago, because I used to be a geeky political scientist, not saying you're geeky, but I was. I used to love measuring things. And so I thought, is it actually true that authoritarian regimes, monarchies, dictatorships, and so on, actually perform better than democracies when it comes to long-term public policy, environment, inequality, health, and so on? What's the actual evidence? You know, is the world really like Singapore or whatever? So I looked at the data, you know, and I worked with this great statistician called Jamie McQuilkin, who's invented something called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which is a kind of a quantitative measure of long-term public policy. And then we plotted that against a very well-known measure of democracy called the VDEM Liberal Democracy measure. It's a sort of gold standard amongst political scientists. And lo and behold, what did we find? We looked at 122 countries. Of the 25 top-scoring countries on this Intergenerational Solidarity Index, in other words, good long-term environmental policy, of the top 25 scoring countries, 21 of them were democracies. Of the bottom 25 scoring countries, 21 of them were authoritarian regimes of various kinds. So maybe King Charles might help, but you have to cross your fingers and hope. But actually, in general, authoritarian regimes of whatever type are problematic for a lot of the reasons that Lisa was mentioning about accountability, fragility, all sorts of stuff like that. So I have no faith in the enlightened despot view. I'm sorry to my dad if he's watching this online.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for that answer. Do we have questions from the audience? Because if you put up your hand, then we can let you ask some questions. We may have a microphone for you somewhere. And we've got some questions here. Yes, do we have a microphone? Could we have it down the front here? There's a question here. Anyone else? I can take a few questions at a time. So if we can I'll take this question here. I can see this gentleman here as well. There's one at the end here. Sorry, if you could pass the microphone down here to the end. It's a lady at the end. And then we'll have the gentleman here. And then I see a hand up there as well. Yes, you're the lady with the glasses. If you could ask your question, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. I think my question is mostly for Roman, and this talk about future generations. And my question is pretty specific. How do we decide how much we dedicate to future generations, and how to sort of quantify how much we need to dedicate to basically billions of people who aren't there yet, and should we basically give everything to them? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask the questions in batches, so we'll keep that for a moment. Could you pass the microphone back up to the end here? There was a gentleman on the end. Thank you. And then there's a lady back there.
Thank you for this interesting introduction. Couple of questions. One is, do you think that you may have overloaded your track with too many tasks and too many goals? And instead of focusing maybe on one goal, or should I say a group of focus goals about climate, by introducing inequality and other social problems, overloads the task, overloads basically the track of all this, and you don't necessarily have a power and support to push all that together. So if you focus on more precise goals, maybe they will be more achievable, and actually you may achieve something quicker. I say quicker, not saying necessarily you can't achieve it. Secondly, from energy point of view, we know that there's a lot of dispute about, for example, energy sources like nuclear energy. And even though it actually may not be, it's actually very green in a sense, in terms of climate. what do you think of the nuclear energy as one of the sources to supplement as a reserve in a cycle of, for example, of winds and sun cycles, for example, the sunshine cycles, to actually supplement energy in the times of the low supply from the renewable natural sources.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And you had your hand up. Who was it? Yes. Are you the same person? Yeah. Just checking.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I think, Sandrine, you mentioned, and you went back to the original kind of definition of democracy as being, like power representing kind of the interests of the people. And I think, this comes back to, like, I think maybe what I believe is a bit of a tension between kind of strengthening and building state institutions and putting them in service to the people, through, for example, the justice system, the law, policy, things like that, and what I feel like is, and the creation of, for example, more alternative local strategies that in which maybe it feels like it's people actually practicing democracy and they're in a more cooperative way. Or, what do you think is a better strategy, or is this just a fake binary? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's a hand up here. I'll take that. Oh, you had another one, did you? Sorry.
Do you think that we need a change in a political system, as in changing democracy for maybe another organization, or rather a change in an economic system to try and explore other alternatives other than capitalism, other than neoliberalism, and other than this hyper-globalized world that we live in since basically the Industrial Revolution?
Okay, thank you. That's not radical at all. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll take another round of questions after this, so save your other questions, and I'll give these to the panel now. Who'd like to begin? Roman, you go ahead.
I can do the first question. Made me think about, when I wrote this book that Fiona mentioned called The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, I gave a draft copy of it to a friend of mine, actually someone you probably know, a guy called Kevin Watkins, who was at the time the CEO of Save the Children. And he said, Roman, I hate your book. And I said, why? He said, well, because there are 125 million children dying right now of malnutrition, right? And you're saying we should be caring about future generations, and how do we have that conversation? How do we even talk about that? And, it was a good question, right? So how do you think about that? And one of the issues here is about the subject of discounting, right? And this is a really important subject where you may know about it. Look, and the way discounting works, discounting is a way of, it's a sort of a mathematical sleight of hand used by governments and businesses to diminish the importance of future generations. So just like if you look at someone, the further and further and further they get away from you, the smaller and smaller they become. That's how most governments and businesses make decisions on long-term investment. In other words, the benefits that accrue to future people are diminished by a certain percentage, which is called the discount rate. And what it means is that any project which basically has more than a 30-year timeline, or really 50-year timeline for the Treasury in the UK, depends on the country, basically will get thrown out because you're not basically adding in the benefits that might come from it. So, for example, a tidal energy project or something like that. So what it means, the first thing we need to do then is to challenge the culture of discounting and raise that, have a public debate about, well, should there even be a discount rate around ecological long-term eco-investments and that kind of thing. And the purpose of this is not to, I don't have a precise formula about exactly how much of, what percentage of the budget should go to future generations. The point is to bring future generations into the room to have a public debate, so that we can actually start talking about these things. And if I was, I'll say one more thing on this. If I was Sophie Howe, who was until last week, the Future Generations Commissioner of Wales, she's just finished her 7-year term, and there's a new commissioner now. I think what she might say to this is that actually we can choose certain kinds of public investment which both help current generations and future generations. So, investment in renewable public transport, not building massive motorways everywhere and so on, helps people today but also helps future generations. And at least as a bridging policy, we need to try and identify what are those kinds of public investment that can do exactly that, that both cross over future and current generations. But the main point, though, I think, is to throw away this idiotic idea of even the guy who invented discounting, Ramsey, in 1928, said it should never be used when it comes to human welfare. It's a sign of discounting is a sign of the failure of the imagination.
Brilliant, thank you. These same people who don't want to invest in things for 50 years are the people who say that we need to wait 50 years for the benefits of Brexit, by the way. Sandrine, what would you like to tell us? Thanks.
I want to add to this because I think, how do you quantify the future if you can't even quantify the present? And we're not placing a value on what truly matters in the present, and this is the biggest problem that we're confronted with. So I fully agree with the discount rate issue, but I also believe that we don't even put a cost on real externalities. We are not actually quantifying what's most important. And coming to the question around, do we need economic change? Absolutely. We absolutely need to shift away from a neoliberal, extractive economic model that is purely based on short-term gains, which enables actually the current over-financialization of the economy, where we can actually have only shareholder value that is dictating the way in which the economy performs, based on productivity, but also based on short-term profit. And that is the biggest issue that we're confronted with, and it is what is making those members of Congress spend 6 to 8 hours with lobbyists rather than thinking about the people that they're supposed to be servicing. So we need to totally shift our perspective of the way in which our democracies function so that our leadership and our businesses are going back to servicing people, planet, and prosperity. Then we start to get into, if you look at those 3 Ps, people, planet, and prosperity, you think of the current generation and the future generation. Now, that very deep tension between the state and decentralization, I think is so clear today. We're seeing, for example, and you saw this, Fiona, and we've all seen it in the way in which we've interacted, for example, with non-state actors through what we call the COP negotiations. What is happening today? Well, it's actually the local authorities. It is mostly the cities across the globe, communities that are really being the decarbonization change agents of our economies. It's not the state, unfortunately. Apart from those in Scandinavia and a few others that have egalitarian, real democracies that are thinking through their future and their present, most of it is communities that are applying the donut economy or other types of well-being economic indicators. And that comes back then to this very important point around, should we just be focusing on the goal of climate change? I don't think that's possible. And what's really interesting is Johan Rockström, who is Mr. Climate Rockstar, and who with us has been working on Earth for All, he himself has said that even if we now have surpassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, our greatest existential risk, and we can go back to whether Sartre or Camus were the real existentialist, and by the way, I wrote my PhD on this, our greatest existential risk is social tensions, even beyond the planetary tensions, because it will be the combination of the planetary tensions and going beyond the planetary boundaries, the health risks and the pandemics that we will see, and obviously the fact that our economies are no longer functioning to service people, that will increasingly create the social tensions that will create backlash, instability in our democracies and our economies, more conflict, etc. So we cannot just, climate is also part of the human spirit and the social fiber of the way in which we engage in our economy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Lisa?
Yes, I'll be brief. I think this question about addressing just climate change separate, it's really a false dichotomy. There is no such thing as kind of only addressing climate change. And we had last year, the IPCC came out with their 6th assessment report. We've had lots of science for more than 3 decades now showing kind of what's happening, what needs to be done. And yet those who have been causing the problem have been slow, have been feet dragging on this. And where we've got to in a point now as a global community is all 194 countries that participate in that UN Convention on Climate Change are committing to doing things to address this problem, even those that have done the least to contribute to it. And there are serious kind of justice implications for coming out of climate change, right? Who are bearing the impacts of these kind of people losing their lives, their livelihoods, communities having to be moved, people being stranded in where they are because they can't move, impacts on cultural heritage loss. And so there's no such thing as kind of climate change without thinking about climate change without thinking about justice and these questions of inequality. And I think the question about change in the political system is a really good one. Looking at the kind of Nordic models, economic models, offer maybe some way forward, though we're seeing, rise of far-right parties across Sweden, Finland, Denmark as well. Someone yesterday gave me as a gift Nancy Fraser's latest book on cannibal capitalism. She's a feminist Marxist economist. Maybe we can meet back here next week, and I might have a better answer based on that.
Brilliant. Yeah. Cannibals, capitalists. Right, I did promise another round of questions. We are running out of time, though. So did you have your hand up? Some people had their hand up. I'm going to give you a chance to ask those questions, but we'll only get 30-second answers. So, we don't even have time for that. We don't even have time for that. I'm so sorry. We started a little bit late, so we don't have time for that. I'm so sorry. If you do have questions, you may be able to grab our panelists afterwards. Sorry about that. I let us carry on too long answering your excellent questions there now and discussing this fascinating subject. So thank you all very much indeed for coming, and please say thank you to our panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you.